Texas, spring of 1945. The sun climbed over Camp House, casting long shadows across rows of white barracks and turning the morning dust into golden haze. In the mess hall, steam rose from industrial pots, while the smell of frying meat drifted through screened windows. A dozen German women stood in line, hollow-eyed, wearing denim work clothes stamped with PW across the back. They had crossed an ocean, expecting brutality. Instead, on metal trays before them, sat portions of beefsteak, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, fresh rolls, and butter more food than most had seen in 2 years of war. The rail cars moved slow through the Texas landscape, wheels clicking against track joints in steady rhythm. Inside, 37 German women pressed faces against small windows, watching America unfold in ways propaganda had never prepared them for. Fields stretched endless under skies too big for European comprehension. Cattle grazed in pastures that seemed to have no boundaries. Small towns appeared and vanished, their water towers gleaming white in the sun, their streets empty in the midday heat. Greta Hartman sat near the back, fingers gripping the edge of her wooden seat. She was 24, though the last year had carved lines around her eyes that made her look older. In Hamburg, she had worked in a communications office, transcribing messages, filing reports, believing in victory until the bombs made belief impossible. The arrest came in February collaboration, they called it, though she had only done her job. The British processed her quickly. Then came the ship, the Atlantic crossing, and now this train moving through a country that looked nothing like the wasteland she had been told to expect. "They're lying to us," whispered Ilse, the woman beside her. She was younger, 19, with blonde hair cut short and eyes that darted nervously. This can't be real. But it was real. The heat was real, pressing through the railcar walls. The dust was real, coating their clothes and skin. And the abundance visible through those windows, the full-grain silos, the fat livestock, the houses with glass windows intact, that was real too. The propaganda officer in Hamburg had shown them photographs. American cities in ruins, children starving in streets, a nation bankrupted by war. Greta had wanted to believe it, needed to believe that their enemies suffered as Germany suffered. But this landscape told a different story. This was a country untouched by bombs, uncrushed by shortages, unbroken by years of siege. The train slowed as it approached Gainesville. Through the windows, they could see the camp in the distance guard towers rising above barbed wire. Rows of barracks arranged in perfect geometric order, an American flag snapping in the wind. Camp House had been built to hold German men, regular soldiers captured in North Africa and Italy. But in early 1945, as the Reich collapsed and Allied forces swept through Germany, women began arriving too. Nurses, communications workers, administrative staff, anyone caught in uniform or suspected of collaboration with the regime. The train stopped with a hiss of brakes and steam. Guards opened the doors, sunlight flooding in so bright after the dim car that several women raised hands to shield their eyes. They descended onto a wooden platform, legs stiff from days of travel, squinting at the vast Texas sky that seemed to swallow everything beneath it. An American lieutenant stood waiting, young with sandy hair and a clipboard tucked under one arm. He looked nervous, shifting weight from foot to foot. Behind him, several guards watched with expressions ranging from curiosity to indifference. One of them, an older man with a weathered face and a southern drawl, stepped forward. "Welcome to Camp House," he said in slow, deliberate English. "You'll be assigned barracks, given work details, and provided meals 3 times daily. Follow the rules, and you'll be treated fairly." Greta understood enough English to catch the meaning, but the words felt surreal. Treated fairly, provided meals. These were not phrases she associated with captivity. In Germany, prisoners scraped by on bread crusts and watery soup. In the camps, she had heard whispers about the detention centers where targeted groups were sent, people starved, systematically, deliberately. Yet here stood an American guard, promising 3 meals a day. They were marched through the compound, past rows of barracks where male prisoners watched from doorways and windows. Some called out in German questions, greetings, warnings. The women kept their eyes forward, following the guards toward a section at the camp's southern edge. The barracks designated for women prisoners were newer, the wood, still pale and smelling of fresh sawdust. Inside, cots lined both walls, thin mattresses covered with rough blankets. Footlockers sat at the end of each bed. Windows on both sides allowed cross-ventilation, and ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. "Better than I expected," Ilse murmured, setting down the small bag containing her few possessions. But it was the evening meal that shattered every assumption they had carried across the ocean. The mess hall stood at the compound's center, a long wooden building with screened windows and electric lights hanging from rafters. At 1700 hours, the dinner bell rang a sound that would become as familiar as breathing over the coming months. The women formed a line outside, uncertain, whispering among themselves. Inside, they could hear the clatter of metal trays and the voices of guards choking with prisoners. Greta entered first, stepping through the doorway into warm air thick with the smell of cooking meat. Her stomach clenched, not from hunger, though she was hungry, but from disbelief. The smell was too rich, too real, too impossible for a prison camp. An American soldier stood behind a serving line, wearing an apron splattered with grease. He was young, maybe 22, with dark hair and an easy smile. He looked at the line of German women and gestured toward the metal trays stacked at the counter's end. "Grab a tray," he said. Then, seeing their confused expressions, he made a lifting gesture and pointed. Greta took a tray. The metal was warm to the touch. She moved down the line, watching as other prisoners ahead of her received portions. On each plate, a piece of beefsteak still steaming, with char marks from a grill. A mound of mashed potatoes with a well in the center, filled with brown gravy. Green beans, pale and soft. 2 rolls with butter melting into golden pools. And at the line's end, slices of white cake with chocolate icing. When Greta reached the soldier with the serving spoon, she stopped. Her hands trembled slightly, causing the tray to rattle. The soldier looked at her, and something in his expression softened. He placed a generous portion of steak on her plate, added potatoes and beans, and handed her 2 rolls instead of 1. "You folks must be hungry," he said quietly. Greta carried her tray to a table and sat. Around her, other women did the same, each settling onto wooden benches with identical expressions of shock. No one spoke. No one moved to eat. They simply stared at the food before them, trying to reconcile what they saw with everything they had been told, everything they had experienced. Ilse was crying. Tears ran down her cheeks, dripping onto the table. "This is more food than my mother saw in a month," she whispered. Before the bombs came, Greta cut into the steak. The knife provided was dull, meant to be safe, but it was enough. The meat was cooked through, but still tender, with juice pooling around the edges. She lifted a piece to her mouth and tasted flavors she had almost forgotten existed. Salt, fat, the char of flame, richness that spread across her tongue and made her throat tighten with emotion she couldn't name. Around the mess hall, male prisoners who had been in the camp longer watched with knowing expressions. They had gone through the same transformation, the shock of abundance, the guilt of eating well while Germany starved, the slow dissolution of propaganda in the face of material reality. Some of them had been there for a year or more, and the camp's rhythms had become normal. They played cards in the evenings, attended English classes, worked in the kitchens or laundry, or on nearby farms during the day. They wrote letters home, though many letters never reached their destinations. They had built a life, however strange, within the wire. An older prisoner, a former officer named Eric Steiner, sat at a nearby table eating his own meal with the casual efficiency of routine. He glanced at the women and remembered his first dinner at Camp House, the same disbelief, the same guilt. He had lost 40 pounds during the retreat through Italy, living on whatever his unit could scavenge. The first American meal had made him physically ill, his stomach unable to process such richness after months of deprivation. Later that evening, after the meal trays had been cleared and prisoners returned to barracks, Greta sat on her cot and tried to write a letter to her sister in Hamburg. The words wouldn't come. How could she explain? How could she tell her sister, who was probably eating potato peels and ersatz coffee, that she, a prisoner, a captive of the enemy, had just eaten beefsteak and cake? She set the pencil down and looked out the window. The Texas sky was darkening, stars beginning to emerge in that vast emptiness. Somewhere out there, beyond the wire and the guard towers and the endless American landscape, Germany was burning. Cities reduced to rubble, civilians starving. Her sister, her father, everyone she had known struggling to survive, while she sat in a camp eating better than she had eaten in years. The guilt was crushing, but so was the realization slowly forming in her mind. Everything they had been told was a lie. The days at Camp House followed a pattern that became familiar through repetition. Morning roll call at 0600, breakfast at 0630, work details from 0800 to 1600 with an hour break for lunch, then dinner at 1700 and free time until lights out at 2200. Work assigned to women prisoners varied: kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning, gardening, occasionally helping in the camp infirmary, where a shortage of medical staff made every hand valuable. Greta was assigned to the camp library, a small building near the administration offices, where prisoners could check out books in German and English, read newspapers, and attend educational classes. The work was light, mostly shelving returns and helping prisoners find materials they wanted. The American corporal who supervised the library, a soft-spoken man from Ohio named Thomas Warren, treated her with careful courtesy, always saying please and thank you, never raising his voice. It was in the library that Greta's understanding of the war truly began to shift. The newspapers arrived twice a week, American publications with photographs and detailed reporting. At first, Greta avoided them, unwilling to confront information that contradicted her beliefs. But curiosity proved stronger than avoidance. One afternoon, alone in the library while Corporal Warren attended a meeting, she opened a copy of Life magazine dated March 1945. The photographs inside showed the liberation of camps in Poland and Germany. Emaciated prisoners behind wire, mass graves, survivors who looked like skeletons draped in skin. The accompanying text described systematic persecution, forced labor, deliberate starvation. The regime's detention centers, places she had heard whispered about, but never truly believed existed on such scale. Greta's hands shook as she turned the pages. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. These were American publications, yes, but the photographs were too real, too detailed to be fabrications. And slowly, pieces of her own experience began to fit into a larger picture she had refused to see. The colleagues who disappeared after asking questions. The neighborhoods emptied overnight. The trains leaving Berlin filled with people who never returned. She closed the magazine and sat in silence while the ceiling fan turned overhead and dust motes drifted through afternoon light. Outside, she could hear prisoners playing volleyball, their shouts and laughter oddly normal against the backdrop of such revelations. That evening at dinner pot roast with carrots and potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie, Greta sat across from Ilse and an older woman named Margarethe, who had worked as a nurse in Munich. They ate quietly while around them the mess hall buzzed with conversation. "Have you read the newspapers?" Greta asked finally, voice low. Margarethe nodded slowly. "I have. Do you believe them?" The older woman was quiet for a moment, fork suspended over her plate. I didn't want to. But I remember things. Patients who came to the hospital with injuries we were told not to document. Orders to deny treatment to certain people. Rumors that we dismissed because believing them felt impossible. She set down her fork. I think I knew. I just didn't want to know. Ilse was crying again, silent tears tracking through the dust on her face. My father believed, she whispered. He truly believed we were making Germany great. He sent my brother to join the forces, and my brother died in Russia. For what? For lies? The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable and crushing. Around them, other prisoners were having similar conversations. The camp had become a place where propaganda dissolved in the face of material reality. Men who had fought believing in destiny now worked alongside American guards who treated them with casual indifference rather than hatred. Women who had served the regime's administrative machinery now read uncensored newspapers and confronted truths they had spent years avoiding. The transformation wasn't universal or immediate. Some prisoners clung to their beliefs, insisting the newspapers were fabrications, that Germany would still prevail, that their suffering meant something beyond senseless waste. But for many, like Greta, the daily rhythm of camp life, the adequate food, the fair treatment, the absence of brutality made denial increasingly difficult. There was a method to the American abundance, though most prisoners didn't recognize it as strategy. In Washington, military planners had learned from World War I that harsh treatment of prisoners created bitter enemies who returned home after the war carrying grievances and rage. The goal in 1945 was different. Deprogram captured Germans, expose them to democratic values, prepare them to rebuild a non-hostile Germany when hostilities ended. Food was psychological warfare waged with beef and butter. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison commanded Camp House and understood this clearly. He had fought in North Africa, seen the desperation of German soldiers in the war's final months, and recognized that many were less committed to ideology than to survival. Give them adequate treatment, let them see American prosperity firsthand, and they would return to Germany as ambassadors of possibility rather than resentment. The camp kitchen budget exceeded what most American civilians spent on food during rationing. Beef several times a week, fresh vegetables when available, desserts made with real sugar. The goal wasn't luxury, it was demonstration. Look what our system produces. Look what our values enable. Compare it to what you left behind. For the women at Camp House, this psychological warfare proved especially effective. Unlike male soldiers who had been indoctrinated for years and had fought in combat, many women prisoners had held administrative or support roles. They had experienced the regime's control, but hadn't been as thoroughly immersed in its military culture. The contrast between their expectations and their treatment hit harder, cut deeper. Greta observed this transformation in herself and others. After a month in the camp, she found herself looking forward to meals not just for the food, but for what the food represented. A world where abundance was possible, where systems didn't require cruelty to function, where treating enemies humanely wasn't weakness, but strength. The American Guards reinforced this message, often without intending to. Corporal Warren brought Greta books from his personal collection: Steinbeck, Hemingway, Mark Twain, and discussed them with her during slow afternoons in the library. Their conversations ranged across literature, politics, philosophy. He never preached or lectured, but his questions made her think, made her reconsider assumptions she had never questioned before. What did you believe about America? He asked one day while they shelved returned books. Greta hesitated, measuring her English carefully. We were told you were weak, soft, that your system was failing, that your people were starving. Warren smiled slightly. And now? She gestured around the library, then toward the mess hall, visible through the window. Now, I think we were told many lies. It was a simple exchange, but it represented a profound shift. The steak on her dinner plate, The books on the shelves, the courtesy with which guards addressed her, all of it accumulated into a comprehensive rebuttal of everything she had been taught. The psychological warfare worked not through force, but through exposure, not through cruelty, but through its absence. By summer, the women at Camp House had settled into routine. The initial shock faded, replaced by the mundane rhythms of captivity. They woke to Texas heat already building before sunrise. They worked their assigned duties. They ate their meals, played cards in the evenings, attended English classes taught by volunteers from Gainesville. Life became, in an odd way, normal. But the guilt remained, especially when they wrote letters home. The camp allowed prisoners to send one letter per week, censored by American officers, who redacted any information that might compromise security. Most letters from the women were heavily edited, entire paragraphs blacked out, because they kept trying to describe the food, the treatment, the abundance that surrounded them. Greta's letters to her sister arrived in Hamburg with so many redactions that they barely made sense. Dear Hannah, I am well, and redacted here at the camp. The weather is very hot, nothing like home. We eat, redacted, and work in redacted. I hope you and Father are safe. I think of you every day, and pray this ends soon. Your sister, Greta. What she had tried to write in those blacked-out sections. We eat beefsteak and fresh vegetables. We work only 8 hours per day with breaks. The Americans treat us better than our own forces treated many of their prisoners. But those truths couldn't be shared. They would sound like collaboration, like propaganda, like betrayal of suffering people at home. Hannah's return letters, when they came, were devastating. Greta, we have no coal. Father sells his books for bread. Yesterday, we ate potato peels and called it soup. Half the street is rubble. The Zimmermans are gone. Their building was hit in April. Please come home. We need you. Greta read these letters in the library, tears blurring the words, while outside prisoners laughed and played volleyball and lived lives of relative comfort. The contrast was unbearable. She existed in abundance while her family starved. She gained weight 5 pounds, then 10, while her sister grew thin. She read books and learned English and ate steak while Hamburg burned. The guilt should have been crushing. For some prisoners, it was. A few refused to eat, pushing away their dinner trays, unable to swallow food while loved ones starved. Camp administrators had to intervene, explaining with surprising gentleness that their suffering would not help anyone at home, that refusing meals would not hasten the war's end, that guilt served no purpose. But for Greta, the guilt transformed into something else, determination. She began to see her experience at Camp House not as betrayal, but as education. She was learning things that would matter when she returned to Germany. She was seeing firsthand that the regime's ideology was built on lies, that alternative systems existed, that civilization didn't require cruelty or conquest. When she went home, and she would go home eventually, she could carry this knowledge with her. In her 8th week at the camp, Greta wrote a letter that the censors allowed through almost intact. Dear Hannah, I am learning English now. I read American newspapers and books. I understand things differently than I did before. When I come home, we will talk about everything I've learned. The world is larger than we were told, and possibility exists in places we never imagined. I love you. Stay strong. This will end. Your sister, Greta. In July, Camp House instituted a new program. Selected prisoners with good behavior records could work on local ranches and farms, helping with labor shortages caused by American men serving overseas. The work paid a small wage, 80 cents per day in camp scrip, that could be spent at the canteen for cigarettes, toiletries, and candy. More importantly, it offered hours outside the wire, in the vast Texas landscape, experiencing a version of freedom that felt almost normal. Greta volunteered immediately. So did Ilse and Margarete, and a dozen other women eager for any change in routine. They were assigned to the Branson Ranch, 15 miles from camp, owned by a weathered 60-year-old named Roy Branson, who ran cattle and horses with the help of his wife, Sarah, and 2 teenage daughters. The first morning, a truck picked them up at 0600, driven by a young guard named Eddie Martinez, who treated the transport run like a casual carpool, making jokes and asking questions about Germany that showed genuine curiosity rather than hostility. The drive through empty Texas roads, with dawn lights spreading across fields and cattle grazing in the distance, felt like traveling to another world. The Branson Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of grassland and mesquite, with a main house painted white, barns and corrals, and windmills turning slowly against that endless sky. Roy Branson met them in the yard, a tall man with sun-creased skin and eyes that missed nothing. He looked over the assembled prisoners and nodded once. "You folks will be helping with feeding, cleaning the barns, mending fences if you're able," he said in a drawl that made English sound like music. "Work hard, don't cause trouble, and we'll get along fine." The work was physical in ways Greta hadn't experienced since childhood. Hauling hay bales, mucking stalls, scrubbing water troughs. The Texas heat made everything harder, sweat soaking through their denim work clothes before the morning ended. But there was satisfaction in it, too, the immediate results of labor, the tired ache of muscles used properly, the presence of animals who didn't care about nationality or politics. During the lunch break, Sarah Branson brought out sandwiches made with thick slices of roast beef, cheese, fresh tomatoes, and bread still warm from the oven. The prisoners sat in the barn's shade, eating and watching horses move in the corral, and for brief moments forgot they were captives at all. It was Roy's younger daughter, Emily, who offered Greta the experience that would stay with her forever. Emily was 16, tall and confident in the way of teenagers raised on ranches, comfortable with horses and work and the vast empty spaces of rural Texas. She had watched the German prisoners curiously all morning, finally approaching Greta while the older woman repaired a section of fence. "You ever ride a horse?" Emily asked. Greta looked up, uncertain. "Once, long time ago. In Bavaria. Want to try again?" 20 minutes later, Greta sat on a mare named Daisy, hands gripping the saddle horn while Emily adjusted the stirrups. The horse shifted beneath her, muscles moving, a living creature powerful enough to throw her, but choosing not to. Emily swung onto her own horse with effortless grace and gestured toward the open field beyond the corrals. "Come on. I'll show you the creek." They rode slowly through summer grass, the sun hot overhead, but the movement creating breeze enough to breathe. Greta's initial fear faded as Daisy settled into an easy walk, following Emily's horse without need for guidance. Around them, the landscape stretched infinite grassland rolling toward distant hills, hawks circling high up, cattle scattered like dark stones across green. For the first time since her arrest in Hamburg, Greta felt completely free. No wire, no guards, no boundaries visible in any direction. Just open space and sky and the steady rhythm of the horse beneath her. She wanted to cry from the beauty of it, from the unexpected grace of this moment, from the surreal kindness of a 16-year-old Texas girl treating a German prisoner like a normal person, deserving of trust and simple joy. They reached the creek, where water ran clear over smooth stones and cottonwood trees, provided shade. Emily dismounted and gestured for Greta to do the same. They let the horses drink while they sat on the bank, boots dusty, faces flushed from heat and riding. "My brother's in France," Emily said after a silence. "Fighting your people, I guess." Greta nodded slowly. "I am sorry. It's not your fault." Emily picked up a stone and tossed it into the water. "My dad says the war's almost over. Says you folks will go home soon." "Yes, I hope so. What will you do when you go back?" Greta considered the question. Hamburg was rubble. Her job was gone. Her future was uncertainty. But she had learned things here, seen things, experienced kindnesses that would shape whatever came next. I will tell people, she said carefully, searching for English words adequate to her meaning. I will tell them what I learned. That enemies can be ... human. That systems can be ... different. That hate is not necessary. Emily looked at her, 16 years old, and wise in the way ranch children often are, growing up surrounded by space and weather and the plain realities of life and death. That's good, she said simply. They rode back to the ranch as afternoon shadows lengthened. That evening, when the truck returned prisoners to Camp House, Greta carried with her a memory that felt like a gift, the feeling of riding through open country, trusted and free, reminded that humanity existed in unexpected places. August brought Ilse's 20th birthday, and with it a small rebellion that revealed how thoroughly the camp's atmosphere had transformed captors and captives alike. Several of the women planned a surprise celebration, pooling their camp script to buy chocolate and cigarettes from the canteen. Margarethe, who had mentioned knowing how to bake, proposed making a cake using ingredients scrounged from the kitchen. The plan required permission from the mess staff and cooperation from guards who could easily have denied the request. Instead, when Greta approached Corporal Martinez with the idea, he grinned and said, "Hell yes, I'll help." The day before Ilse's birthday, Greta and Margarethe snuck into the camp kitchen during the afternoon lull between lunch and dinner preparation. The head cook, a massive black sergeant from Louisiana named James Walker, had been informed of the plan and was already assembling ingredients: flour, sugar, eggs, butter, cocoa powder. "Y'all know how to bake?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "I helped my mother," Margarethe said in careful English. Sergeant Walker laughed, a deep sound that filled the kitchen. "All right, then. Let's make this girl a proper birthday cake." For 2 hours they worked together, a German prisoner, a German nurse, and an American sergeant who had every reason to hate them, but instead measured flour and cracked eggs and told stories about birthday cakes his grandmother made in New Orleans. The kitchen filled with the smell of baking chocolate, warm and rich, almost overwhelming in its sweetness. When the cake came out of the oven, golden and perfect, Sergeant Walker stepped back and nodded with satisfaction. "That'll do," he said. Then, after a pause, "You know, my unit helped liberate one of those camps in Germany. The detention centers. Saw things there I can't forget." His expression grew distant. "But I also know people are more than the worst things their countries do. You ladies seem decent enough. So happy birthday to your friend." The cake appeared at dinner the next evening, carried into the mess hall by Corporal Martinez, while prisoners sang first in German, then in English, the two languages mixing in the warm air. Ilse cried, of course. She had cried often since arriving at Camp House, but these tears were different. Surprise, gratitude, the overwhelming sensation of being seen as human in a place she had expected only punishment. They cut the cake with dull knives and ate it with the same metal forks they used for dinner. The chocolate was rich, almost too sweet after years of deprivation, and several prisoners could only manage a few bites before their stomachs protested. But the gesture mattered more than the cake itself. This was American guards and German prisoners celebrating together, sharing something small and joyful, in defiance of everything the war had tried to make them believe about each other. Later, in the barracks after lights out, Ilse lay on her cot and spoke to the darkness. "How do we reconcile this?" Her voice was soft, barely audible over the ceiling fans. "They bomb our cities, kill our soldiers, defeat us completely. But then they give us steak and bake us birthday cakes. How do we make sense of it?" Greta, in the next cot, had no answer. A contradiction was too large, too complete. But perhaps that was the point, to overwhelm their certainties, to make reconciliation of old beliefs impossible, to force them to build new understanding from the ground up. "I think," Margarethe said from across the room, "that we were wrong about what strength means. We were taught that strength is domination, is cruelty, is making others afraid. But maybe real strength is being powerful and choosing kindness anyway. Maybe that's what frightens them most, not our forces, but our example. The room fell silent. Outside, night sounds filtered through screens. Crickets, distant voices from guard towers, the faint rumble of trucks on roads beyond the wire. In the darkness, 37 German women lay awake, thinking about steak and birthday cakes and the strange mercy of enemies who fed them better than their own country ever had. September brought news that everyone had expected, but still struck with the force of revelation. Germany had surrendered months earlier in May. The European war was over. The Pacific theater continued, but in Europe, hostilities had ended. The announcement came during morning roll call. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stood before assembled prisoners and delivered the news in clear, slow English that allowed even those with limited language skills to understand. There would be repatriation eventually, he explained, but the process would take time. Germany was chaos cities destroyed, government dissolved, infrastructure shattered. The Allies needed to establish order before prisoners could be safely returned. Until then, they would remain at Camp House. The reaction was muted, complex, relief mixed with anxiety. The war was over, but what did that mean for prisoners who would return to a devastated homeland? What jobs existed in a ruined economy? What cities remained standing enough to house refugees and displaced soldiers and prisoners returning from all corners of a shattered empire? Greta stood in the hot Texas sun and felt vertigo. The future stretched ahead, formless and uncertain. Hamburg was rubble. Her sister and father, were they even alive? Communications had been spotty. Her last letter from Hannah was dated June. Anything could have happened since then. That night, the mess hall served what the guards jokingly called a victory dinner. Chicken instead of the usual beef, with mashed potatoes, corn on the cob, and apple pie. The meal felt less celebratory than surreal. Victory for the Americans meant defeat for Germany, and yet here they sat, eating together, the distinction between victor and vanquished, blurred by months of unexpected kindness. In October, the first group of male prisoners was selected for repatriation. They boarded buses amid cheers and tears and anxiety, headed for ships that would carry them back across the Atlantic to whatever remained of home. The women watched them go and wondered when their turn would come. Work continued. The Branson Ranch program expanded as more local farms requested help with harvest season. Greta spent her days picking cotton, hauling squash, helping Sarah Branson can vegetables for the winter. The physical labor was demanding but rewarding, and the pay, though minimal, accumulated in her camp account, money she could take home when repatriation came. On her last day at the ranch in November, Roy Branson called her aside. They stood near the barn while late afternoon sun painted everything golden, and he handed her a folded piece of paper. "My address," he said simply. "When you get home, write and let us know you made it safe. And if things are hard over there, if you need anything, you write again. We'll see what we can do." Greta took the paper, throat tight. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you kind to me?" Roy Branson looked out across his land, jaw working slightly. "I fought in the First War," he said finally. "France, 1918. Saw things no one should see. Killed men I had no quarrel with, just because politicians told us to. When I came home, I swore I'd never let hate take root in me again. War's one thing, sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's not. But the people caught up in it, they're just people. You strike me as decent, Greta, so I'll treat you decent. Simple as that." He shook her hand, a firm, dry grip, and walked back toward the house. Greta stood in the Texas dust, holding an address that represented something she was still learning to understand, that people could choose compassion, even when the world gave them permission for cruelty. December brought news that repatriation would begin for the women prisoners after Christmas. Ships were being allocated, travel routes established, coordination with British and Soviet authorities negotiated. The process would take months, but it had officially started. The camp administration organized a final dinner for prisoners preparing to leave, Americans and Germans together, a strange mirror of Thanksgiving. Long tables were set up in the mess hall, decorated with paper garland made in craft workshops, candles in glass jars, even a few sprigs of greenery that passed for festive in the Texas winter. The meal was ambitious: roasted turkey with all the trimmings, cranberry sauce, stuffing, sweet potatoes, green bean casserole, rolls with butter, and 3 kinds of pie for dessert. Sergeant Walker and his kitchen staff worked for days, preparing everything, treating the dinner with the seriousness of a state banquet. When prisoners entered the mess hall that evening, they found guards and officers already seated at tables, waiting to share the meal. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison stood and gestured for everyone to sit, and raised a glass of cider. To shared humanity, he said simply, to lessons learned, to hoping we never need to meet like this again. They ate, and it was strange and sad and oddly beautiful. Guards told jokes. Prisoners laughed. Someone produced a harmonica and played traditional German folk songs, then American tunes, then strange hybrids that mixed both traditions. Ilsa danced with Corporal Martinez, clumsy and giggly, while others clapped rhythm. Sergeant Walker distributed extra slices of pie, insisting everyone eat until they couldn't possibly manage another bite. Greta sat beside Corporal Warren, who had brought her a gift: a small leather-bound notebook and a fountain pen. "For your writing," he said. "When you get home, document everything. Tell people what you saw here. Tell them about the steak." She accepted the gift, fingers tracing the smooth leather. "Will anyone believe me? Maybe not at first. But truth has a way of settling in eventually. Just keep telling it." That night, after the dinner dishes were cleared and prisoners returned to barracks, Greta lay on her cot and opened the notebook. On the first page, in careful English, she wrote, "Camp House, Texas, December 1945. Today, we ate turkey with our captors. 6 months ago, I expected cruelty. Instead, I found steak and birthday cakes and people who taught me that enemies are made, not born. I am going home to a destroyed country. I do not know what I will find there, but I know what I learned here. Abundance is possible. Kindness is strength, and the lies we were told about weakness were actually descriptions of mercy. Germany must rebuild not just buildings but souls. I will carry this knowledge home. I will tell them about the steak." February 1946. Greta stood on the deck of a transport ship, watching the German coastline emerge from morning fog. Beside her, Ilse and Margarete, and 24 other women who had shared Camp House, prepared to disembark at Bremerhaven. The port was a ruin, cranes twisted like broken fingers, warehouses collapsed, the water filled with partially submerged ships. This was Germany now, defeated, occupied, starving. They had known it would be bad, but the reality exceeded every fear. As they descended the gangway, refugees pressed against barriers, faces hollow, hands reaching for any scrap of help. British soldiers maintained order with fixed bayonets, looking tired and overwhelmed. Greta carried her small bag of possessions, the clothes she had worn on arrival, now clean and mended, the notebook from Corporal Warren, a few photographs taken at the ranch, and the address Roy Branson had given her. Also in her bag, 10 pounds of flour, 5 cans of beef, and 2 chocolate bars that Sergeant Walker had pressed into her hands on departure day, whispering, "For your family." Godspeed. The train to Hamburg took 18 hours, moving slowly through a landscape of devastation. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges collapsed, fields cratered, people living in cellars and makeshift shelters, faces showing the same hollow exhaustion Greta had seen at the port. This was what defeat looked like. This was the price of lies and conquest and certainty. Hamburg was worse than she had imagined. Entire neighborhoods simply gone, replaced by fields of brick and twisted metal. The building where she had lived stood partially, 2 walls remaining, the rest open to weather. A family of strangers had claimed the intact rooms on the ground floor. She found her sister in a refugee center, a converted warehouse where hundreds of displaced people slept on pallets and shared communal meals of watery soup. Hannah was alive, but transformed 20 pounds lighter, hair prematurely gray, eyes that had seen too much. They embraced, both crying, while around them other refugees pretended not to notice. "You look healthy," Hannah whispered, pulling back to examine her sister. "How?" "They fed us," Greta said. "The Americans. They fed us well." That night, in a corner of the warehouse they shared with 6 other families, Greta divided the flour and beef among neighbors. She kept 1 chocolate bar for Hannah and gave the other to a mother with 3 small children. Then she opened her notebook and began to read aloud what she had written. People gathered, curious. Greta read about Texas and steak and birthday cakes, and a 16-year-old girl who had trusted her to ride a horse through open country. She read about guards who baked with prisoners and officers who toasted shared humanity, and a black sergeant who remembered horrors but chose kindness anyway. Some listeners scoffed. "Impossible," they said. "Propaganda. Americans don't treat prisoners that way." But others recognized truth when they heard it. They had seen their own government's lies dissolve in the face of reality. They were ready to consider that maybe, just maybe, there were better ways to build a society than the one that had led them to this warehouse, this hunger, this defeat. "Tell us more," someone said. "Tell us everything." So Greta did. Night after night, she shared her testimony. And slowly, so slowly, it was almost imperceptible, people began to imagine a different future. Not Germany as it had been, built on certainty and dominance and lies, but Germany as it might become, rebuilt on humility and truth and the recognition that strength could mean choosing mercy when cruelty was easier. The stake had been psychological warfare, yes, but it had also been something more, a demonstration that abundance and kindness weren't mutually exclusive, that treating enemies fairly wasn't weakness, but a different kind of strength. Greta carried this knowledge back to a shattered homeland, and in small ways, through quiet conversations in refugee warehouses and church basements in makeshift communities, she helped plant seeds of a new understanding. Years later, when Germany had rebuilt and democracy had taken tentative root, Greta would look back on Camp House and recognize the strange gift she had received there. The gift wasn't just the food or the fair treatment or even the survival. The gift was the shattering of certainty, the destruction of propaganda, the forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths that made new thinking possible. She never forgot the taste of that first steak, not because it was delicious, though it was, but because it represented the moment her understanding of the world cracked open and began, painfully and necessarily, to rebuild. And on quiet evenings, when memory stirred, she would remember riding through Texas grassland on a borrowed horse, trusted and free, while a teenage girl showed her that enemies were just people who hadn't yet become friends. The war had ended, but the real work, the reconstruction not just of cities, but of souls, had only begun.